Hello, I'm Lyssa deHart, and welcome to the coaching studio. Today, I am just absolutely feel privileged to have Tracy Sinclair, MCC with the International Coaching Federation, is my guest on the show today. Tracy, thank you so much for being willing to come on the show and share yourself with the audience.
Well, thank you, Lyssa. The pleasure is all mine. I'm delighted to have been invited, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
As am I. One of the first questions I really like to ask people is a little bit about your personal evolution into coaching. Very few people start off born as coaches. We may have coaching, genes in us, but we don't necessarily find ourselves dropped straight into coaching. And I'm really curious, what was your journey into coaching?
It's a great question, isn't it? Because I know that for most people, coaching is a second, third, or even fourth career, isn't it? And, I know within the ICF, we've often talked about, does it have to be that way? Just as a sideline to that conversation of what if people took up coaching as their first career? How would that be, and what would be needed in place for that to be an option? Because that would be a whole new domain, I think, for our profession. But as you sort of highlighted there, it wasn't my first career, and I guess I might say I've had a bit of a portfolio career. I've done a few different things, ranging from being a Spanish teacher, interpreter and translator in my first career, through to working in financial services in operational management, and then through to leadership development, and then into coaching. So I guess the fourth main area for my world. I think the trigger for me, there were two things actually. One was when I took a little bit of time out to have my children, which was 18 years ago. I have twins who are 18 now. I'd already been running my broad spectrum leadership development business for quite a few years at that point. And when I took some time out to have them, and I was thinking about coming back into my business, I guess if I'm really honest, I felt a little bit bored and stale, in truth, of thinking, gosh, am I going to go back and just do the same thing that I've been doing for the last 10 or 12 years at that time? And I'm not, in some ways I am a creature of habit, but I'm not very good actually at doing the same thing over and over again, because I know I can plateau and get a little bit stale. So I was thinking about how could I bring something new and fresh and interesting into my business. And I went to a few different conferences and seminars and workshops. And I went on a one-day conference in London on this thing called coaching. And I thought, oh, what's all that about? And how is it different? In my question to myself, how is it different from counselling? Because in a previous life, I was also a counsellor and worked alongside my financial services role as a counsellor, mainly in addiction, working with drug and alcohol addicts. So it initially triggered my interest to think, well, what's this thing called coaching vis-a-vis counselling? So I was quite intrigued. And then the second thing that really hooked me was that the person that was giving a speech on a presentation on coaching said that he felt that coaching was not something that had just been cooked up by a few bored people in a coffee shop one day trying to think about the next cool thing to do. Right. He believed that coaching was evolving as a way of communicating with ourselves and others to meet a need in society. And I have to admit, that just floored me. I just thought, wow, that feels quite important, quite impactful. It just really hooked my interest. And so I researched what that was about, very quickly got sold on the idea of doing coach training. And then, of course, as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah. Well, there's two things that you brought up that are really capturing my attention, and I'm going to share them both and then see which one maybe shows up strongly for you. But I hear from a lot of people, and my background is as a clinical social worker. So, I mean, I that distinction between coaching and counseling often is a huge, like, I don't know, sticky wicket. I mean, it is just like, it is a mess for a lot of people because there are so many crossovers into the point of your book I'll talk about in your bio. The underpinnings of coaching are psychological, right? And so, but then so is business leadership. And so I'm really curious, on one hand, around what your thinking is around that intersection and differences between coaching and counseling. And then this other piece that you brought up, which is really the evolution of coaching, it is an evolution that supports the growth of people and society and cultures as a whole. And so those two areas are really like for me right now as I'm listening to you talk. Is there one that you would be most interested in talking about first?
Well, as you share those things, Lyssa, in my mind, they're connected. Actually.
Oh, I'd love to hear that.
Because so if we go with the first one, yes, I do. Whilst we may not say that a coach has to be a clinical psychologist to be a good coach, I do think that there is a body of work that is psychologically grounded that underpins the efficacy of coaching and its competencies. And I just happen to have an interest in that. And my interest, I suppose, in becoming a counsellor was because I am passionate about the evolution of human development. Mm-hmm. And in that context, counselling, I guess, was more of a, it's a dis-ease model in terms of focusing on supporting someone to heal or to resolve something from their present or their past that's really, really holding them back. And what was interesting about my experience as being a counsellor was I struggled, if I'm honest. I think of myself as quite young then. I was in my late 20s when I trained to be a counsellor. And I felt as though I got really quite burnt by some of the exposure of some of the things that I was working with clients that wasn't getting processed for me. And this takes us to maybe a conversation that you and I were having previously about supervision. Mm-hmm. Is in that context, the supervision that I was in at the time was much more focused on almost like a policing approach to, am I being fit for practice? Am I being safe with other people? Rather than, am I, as the practitioner, processing and resolving and protecting myself? And I guess was naive at that time, and found that I wasn't protecting myself. I did not have my shield, and I took it home, and it weighed heavy to the point where I decided I had to stop, because I wasn't able to find a way of processing and separating myself from other people's pain. And I found I had a very strong attraction to empathizing with people's very difficult feelings, which is great for empathy, but it's not great if you can't process it. And I didn't have the capacity or the skills to do that at the time. And so the outcome for me was I walked away from that work, which was a shame, because it really felt in my heart as though that was something that I wanted to do. And so when I discovered coaching, it was a bit of a, oh, wow, this is amazing, because, excuse me, there is a way that I can work with people in something that has similarities, but is aspirational and is forward moving and is positive and about the future. And so it was an amazing discovery for me that there was this different way of working that I could still support people, enable them in their lives to be their best and to tap into their potential, rather than the more, below the line kind of work. Having said that, I do now since carry a strong interest in the boundary between the two. I call it the grey space, which is where, some cases are clearly therapeutic in need and some are clearly a prime opportunity for coaching. But then there's a few cases that we see more and more coming up that are in a grey area, which leads in a way to your other point of how is coaching evolving, and is coaching, to what extent does coaching extend into the place of underpinning people's well-being? And I use that term more than mental health, because maybe if someone's mental health is truly compromised, it is more of a therapeutic context. But I do strongly believe that coaching does have a place to underpin someone's well-being before their mental health deteriorates to a point where a therapeutic intervention is necessary, which would, I believe, be such a proactive contribution to society, especially at the moment.
Yeah. A couple of things that are from my experience when I'm thinking about my therapeutic practice is that one of the things you said earlier, which I have really experienced, is, therapy is a medical model. And so you called dis-ease, but it is a medical model, and it needed to be in order to get insurance and to be seen as not just quackery. It was a real thing. And I get that. On the other hand, there's a tendency in a medical model for one person to be the expert and the other person to be the patient, right? And there's a huge shift that happens as we shift into partnership and what's possible. And I think back also, and this is to your second point, I had people in my private practice that clearly needed therapy. They needed counseling. They needed mental health support. It was very clear. And then 80 to 90% of my practice were people who were getting the diagnosis of adjustment disorder so that you'd meet the needs of the insurance, but that really were just struggling with something going on in their life that they were having trouble adjusting to. And that's a huge area where coaching can be so beneficial. And they don't meet the need of having a real psychologically damaged space that they're coming from. They're really needing support and moving forward to the next level. And so I really appreciate you bringing that forward. I don't know, that strikes me as just an important concept for coaches to understand, though, what you're speaking to. There is a place, and yet there's a huge space for helping people move forward. How does that shift into that forward thinking? How do you see that play out with the people that you work with?
Well, I think about it, it's a very simplistic way of thinking about it in a way. Is I think about an axis almost of from 0 to +10 and -10, and if someone is in the pluses, then their well-being is above the line, and if it's lower, then it's below the line. And I guess, who in this world is always at a +10, that we know that even joy and happiness are transient emotions and states that we're not experiencing all the time. So I guess, without wanting to be sort of clinical about it, most of us in our lives are probably hovering around that space of anything from 5 to 10, up and down throughout life. When you start to drop below 5 and you're getting closer to 0, and that's where you're tending to baseline, then my sense is that the table is turning a little bit from being able to forward focus to more, okay, what is it that's dragging me down, that's holding me back? And different people that I've talked about that sort of in the mental health space who score themselves, you know, like we do in coaching, you know, how confident do you feel about this out of 10 kind of thing. And that can be a marker as well in people sort of referencing or framing their sense of well-being. You know, am I a 1 out of 10? Am I a 3 out of 10? And I know, for example, that someone that I know very well who struggles with mental health challenges, when they are at a 1 out of 10, then suicidal ideation is very present for them, you know, and if it drops much lower, then that's when certain alarm bells need to be rung, as it were. My thinking about this is what about the people who are finding that their lives are generally dropping to a place of, you know, I'm hanging out at a 3, 4, and a 5 most of the time. It's not that their world has dropped to a point where there's an alarm bell ringing off that they ought to do something medically, but they ignore it because it isn't an alarm bell, and it just becomes a pattern and a habit. And it feels in a way as though society, and I don't know how this is in the US, I'm speaking obviously more from experience here in the UK, is the system is there to try to put a safety net under people when the alarm bells need to go off. But by then we've sort of left it a bit late, and we've got to come from so far down. And I think that a lot of people that typically come into coaching are perhaps those people that are hovering at 6, 7, and 8 in their lives, where they're going for more and more, and how can I be at my best and thrive? I do think there's an opportunity for coaching in that space of 3, 4, and 5, you know, Absolutely. Before you're really becoming where it's becoming a more clinical need, a therapeutic need, but where someone could actually, there is still the capacity for forward planning, still the capacity for hope, still the capacity to set goals, even though life feels as though it's dropped. I have a sense that there's a sweet spot there that potentially, with the right kind of approach, I believe that a coaching approach could still really help turn that, rather than it just dropping even further.
Yeah, I really completely agree, because I do think that when you think about it, how many people are living lives where it's become habitual, but they're not finding joy or energy or enthusiasm in the work that they do, or their relationships, or just insert anything here, and what's possible for them if they were to really find what that deeper, meaningful purpose for their life is, and then really put their energy there and felt bold enough or confident enough in order to do that. Which actually makes me think of something you said earlier, which is, what if it was a first career? What if people were going to college and this is your first career? I've only ever been a coach. And so talk about what your thinking is around how that might shift things for people. Because I know for myself, my coaching journey, my therapeutic journey definitely taught me a lot about myself and has been incredibly useful. But the self-reflective process of coaching has amplified that in a different way, and more to what you were talking about around coaching supervision, around self-awareness and how I take care of myself and how I show up in relationships. So I'm really interested in, how do we make this a first career?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And you know, talking as I'm thinking here, so thinking aloud, as it were, 2 things immediately come to mind. One is our education systems across the world, and also our beliefs. So on the education system, my guess is, and again, I'm speaking mainly from the UK perspective, but I imagine it may be similar elsewhere, is what psychology degrees are out there that actively also position that an avenue from a psychology degree could be coaching. You know, when we think about, as someone entering into a psychology degree or other degrees, behavioral psychology, behavioral sciences, organizational psychology, all of those kinds of domains that at that academic university level, you know, how many of them actually include within that broad spectrum of possibilities of careers coming out of that kind of a degree, include the provision of coaching? I doubt, and I might be proven wrong, I hope I am actually, but I doubt there are many that have coaching on the map or coaching on the radar as a potential first career avenue coming out of that academic experience.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is the beliefs. You know, coaching is sort of believed to be a third career profession, or, you know, a profession that you do when you've reached a certain age, or that you've had a certain amount of life experience or corporate experience or, you know, professional experience. And
yeah,
I think we need to challenge that, because apart from all of the very important things around being inclusive and not discriminating, but there's a lot of isms around coaching. You know, is it genderist? Is it ageist? Is it sort of sectorist? I don't know. You know, there are certain isms and things that we have in coaching that I think we could do well to challenge, especially with the fact that the young population that we have at the moment, they are going to be leading our world, not us. You know, and they are navigating some very tricky experiences that they are inheriting, and the pandemic has done nothing but make that ever more complex. I would say that having young coaches coming into our space would be an enormous contribution.
Several things popped into my mind as you were talking. One is the isms, but I think there's also an underlying ego of I'm an expert at something, and so now I'm a coach so that I can coach you because from my expertise, which, as you and I both know, is the journey away from that towards being a master certified coach, is the letting go of all of the ego and expertise, which is an unraveling that is not comfortable, but also necessary in order to be in partnership again with somebody. And I wonder, like, if I had come into coaching, like if that had been a genuine avenue and not a, you know, sort of an afterthought that universities are using to create income, but rather a real genuine, I'm going into psychology or social work or one of the helping professions in some way, and coaching is an option where I really learn about how to hold the space in a partnering conversation. I wonder of all the things that, because I didn't know, I could have come from the place of curiosity so much easier. I mean, that's the thing that really shows up as you're saying that, like all the things that have to be unlearned in order to become a good coach versus already just coming in unlearned of them. For lack of a better way of saying it.
I couldn't agree more. You know, this is the thing, isn't it? That is the paradox in some ways of coaching, is that we have an infrastructure or a process or a belief system around coaching and who's suitable to become a coach that does have this element of experience, knowledge, expertise, and wisdom, whatever that might be, that you have to have, and then we are then told to unlearn those things, and so there's got to be a way of taking that freshness, you know, and that's not to in any way minimize the value of age, minimize the value of experience and history. Of course those things have a place, but I think that coaching is missing a huge opportunity for you know, very innovative development as a profession, if we were to stay with that fixed perspective of how and when and who comes into it. We all bring different things, and what we might bring in history, a younger person brings in fresh perspective. And you know, of course, again, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I noticed this with my own children. Younger people and younger leaders are very different to how we were. There is an enormous shift in values, beliefs, expectations, and principles of how they want to live, how they want to be with themselves and each other, that are so different to perhaps, some of the previous generations. We also have to make sure that coaching as a concept stays up with that new way of being coming into our system, because otherwise, it would lose its relevance.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with you again. And it would lose that, what makes it brilliant is that it has an opportunity to evolve. And it has an opportunity to evolve in ways that meet people's needs and also invite people to learn how to show up as their best. And I would never want to say that there's a person younger than me who hasn't maybe had as much experience, maybe not exactly the same experience, but has lived a full experience by the time they're in their 20s. And the meaning that they make from that and the capacity to use it to inform their curiosity is just as valid for them as it is for somebody who's of a different generation. And I think back on myself in my 20s and how I wasn't trained to use my curiosity to, my knowledge to inform my curiosity, but rather I was just curious, right? And so there's a yes and there, where there's a place for the energy and enthusiasm and a new broad way of looking at things to be combined with this sense of, and to the benefit of whom and for the purpose of what, right? So that the person is learning how to curb the enthusiasm in such a way that they're useful to themselves, but also to their person that they're working with. That's what shows up as you're talking for me.
Absolutely. And there's an initiative that I'm working on here in the UK at the moment, which is about bringing coaching and coaching skills to the 18 to 25-year-old population, which I guess is the kind of age group we're thinking about here. And it at its highest level, it's an opportunity to introduce offering coaching to younger people, either one-to-one or group, and then transitioning them to thinking about, if they're finding it valuable, how could they pay it forward to other young people, usually in a university system where older students will pay it forward maybe to the first year students, where they can start learning some coaching skills themselves. And it's amazing when I'm working with them. You think, why on earth did I ever think that they wouldn't get this? You know what I mean? I mean, it's just, I feel embarrassed almost to say that, to think, why would I have held such limiting beliefs or biases about their capacity to get it because they happen to be 21 years old? I mean, it's absurd. And I'm just in awe of some of the wisdom and the groundedness and the maturity and the developed thought, when I'm actually then finding that I'm just facilitating them coaching each other, as a group, and they are stepping in and stepping up to that with very limited instruction in coaching skills. They're there. I just think there's a huge opportunity to do more.
Yeah. Well, what world would we have if younger people were invited to evolve at a younger age? Where did the story come that you have to have a midlife crisis in order to determine a new direction or get to a place of burnout, which you didn't mention is one of the reasons people come into coaching. But I know for myself, I was so burned out that I just needed to do something completely different. And coaching was close enough to what I was doing that I didn't have to reinvent, everything that I knew, and I could leverage it in a way that brought me passion again to the work that I was doing. And yet that's a silly story if we choose to believe it. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be the truth, nor is it the truth. It is just one story. So Tracy, I have very much enjoyed this conversation with you today. I'm just curious, what are you up to that you would like our listeners to know about? I will be creating links in the description of the show to send people your direction, but I'd love to hear what you're up to lately.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm usually up to far too many things, actually. One of my flaws, or maybe it's a quality on the one hand and a flaw definitely on the other, is I'm over enthusiastic, because I just think there are so many cool things to get involved in. But one of the things I'm up to is what I shared with you, is working with a colleague to really try to focus on leveraging, bringing coaching and coaching skills to the 18 to 25-year-old population, looking to lobby and influence funders for that, corporates who want to fund and support that kind of work, as well as academic institutions as well. So that's quite a big part of what I'm involved in. I'm also, going back to our first conversation, quite involved in mental health activities. So I have a partnership with a big mental health charity here in the UK, where we collaborate on me supporting their staff. So enabling the people who are trying to help others receive coaching in a way that's accessible to them, because as a charity, of course, funding is not always readily available. So those two initiatives are things that I tend to do I have a part of my business called Coaching with Conscience, which is really about stepping aside from the commercial side of the work that I do with corporates to more thinking about how could I get involved in projects that are trying to make a difference in society in some way. So they're my two passionate areas of those. But in my business, I'm just wearing multiple hats, I suppose. I'm teaching, training, have an accredited program. I coach still, mentor, coach, supervise. And I like to also work with organizations who want to, well, we talk about coaching culture. I have a view on coaching culture that goes beyond just an organization having lots of coaching skills in it, to also thinking about some of the philosophy and values and principles that underpin a coach approach, and how could those inform culture in an organization.
I honestly think we have another conversation in front of us here, because that is so important. Like, how many coaches have been in organizational coaching where the lip service is we want a coaching culture, the lip service is we want to train people to become more coach-like in their skill set with their teams and the people that they manage, and yet the powers that be, the infrastructure really isn't there to support that, even with all the, like, this would be really good. And so that I feel like there's another conversation there with that, just like, how do we get organizations to recognize that these young people coming out with a coaching mindset already would be brilliant employees. And then also, how do you really put your actions in alignment with your words? Yeah,
absolutely. And then that's the thing, isn't it? There are so many things to do, so many possibilities and avenues. I wish there were more hours in the day sometimes, but and then, like you said earlier, on my personal journey, it's that ongoing journey of knowing myself and meeting my ego when it rears its head, because of course I'm human, so it will do, but trying to let go of some of those things. I'm so much more fascinated now by the being of the coach than the doing of coaching, even though I'm not underestimating the importance of the doing of coaching in a way that's effective and skilled. But this idea of how are we being as a practitioner and as an instrument of our work, and how does that then inform how we are being with each other in society? I think that's on a more spiritual level, if you like, that's where my
Huge.
energy is drawn.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much for being on the coaching studio today. I have absolutely enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. We've talked about so many wonderful things. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
You are absolutely welcome. I wanted to follow up the podcast really quickly and tell you a little bit more about my guest today. Tracy Sinclair is a master certified coach with the International Coach Federation. She does coaching supervision. She is a mentor coach. She is a coach trainer, as well as being an assessor for the ICF as people are going through their credentialing process. She is the co-author of Becoming a Coach, the Essential ICF Guide, which was published in 2020. Becoming a Coach provides a comprehensive guide to coaching for coaches of all skill levels and all levels of experience. It is really an opportunity to explore the psychological underpinnings of coaching and how that also relates to the new updated core competency model. Tracy founded Coaching with Conscience, which exists to have a positive impact on society and our environment through coaching. She leads projects related to mental health, well-being, and coaching young leaders. Tracy has volunteered with the ICF in the last 10 years in various global and local roles, to include being the global chair in 2018, which in fact was the first time that I met her at the Global Leadership Forum in Warsaw, Poland. So thank you again, Tracy, for being on the show. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, share, ring bells, do all that sort of stuff, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Cheers.